Welcome to the Lend Academy podcast, episode number 241. This is your host, Peter Renton, founder of Lend Academy and co-founder of the Lend It Fintech Conference. Today on the show, we are doing something very different. We are going to be talking about boards, in particular small company boards. It's not a topic that gets much discussion, but it can make or break and can be super important on the success of your fintech company. So I'm delighted to welcome back Mike Baliman. He is the founder of the London Fintech Podcast, and he is the author of the new book, which is called The Real Politic of the Unlisted Company Board, Making Your Board an Engine of Growth. And I wanted to get him on because the book just came out, and it's a topic that I think is not discussed enough, as I said. So we go through in detail how a CEO or founder should think about their board and the different sort of transitions that a board needs to go through, how to position itself to go public. We talk about some of the essential elements for success in a board and how really to make a board be an engine of growth for your company. It was a fascinating interview. I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome back to the podcast, Mike.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a while.
Yes, it has. Good to have you back. So, as I said in the introduction, you have recently published a book, and I know we've chatted over the last year or two about this several times, but maybe you could just get started by giving the listeners the thinking behind the book. Why did you write it?
Well, I like your politeness, first of all, in terms of we chatted once or twice over the past 2 or 3 years. I think along the lines of the last 2 years or 3 years, I've been saying to you, I've got this great book. It'll be out in the autumn and I must come and speak at your conference.
Right.
And every year it wasn't out. Why did I decide to write the book? Well, partly because I'm sort of getting old, and my buddies who are rather sort of wiser than I just stayed in mainstream FS, and they've gone plural. They've joined boards of big co's and all that kind of stuff over the years. And that's an attractive business model for, when you're approaching your 60s, in that you can gradually wind down. I mean, neither I nor my partner would like to go to 0 days work, but we don't want to be doing 5 days work in 10 years' time. So there was a motivation to go plural. And then actually, Peter, it's absolutely all your fault, because about 3 years ago at Lend It, I was drinking coffee and just chatting idly to some founders along the lines of going plural and nedding on fintechs and what they thought and all this kind of stuff. And it was at a Lend It. And I spoke to quite a few founders because they were around. And they all thought something different of me, which is not surprising. I've done a variety of things over the years. But the penny suddenly dropped that they all had implicitly a very, very different concept of what the board is there for in a small company. And I thought, wow, that's really curious. And literally, it was then that.
Okay. So you provide a bit of history in your book, which I found fascinating, and maybe we could share with the listeners sort of. So, two-part question. One is, where did the idea for an incorporated entity come from? And then out of that, when did people start having boards of these entities?
So this is covered in 2 chapters of the book. I mean, the subtitle of the book is Content and Context, and content is the majority of the book, which is, as it were, a car mechanics manual for a founder. What you do when you've got problems with the tires, with the engine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The context is, as you say, the history of this, and it is actually surprisingly unknown in one place, which is one reason it took me a long time to piece it together, and be also very fascinating, I feel. So the first written records we have are from 3000 BC, some 5,000 years ago, and they record payments to labourers in Bali. And we know quite a lot more about 4,000 years ago, ancient Assyria, which is now modern Iraq. And by complete miracle, 23,000 almost entirely business records have been preserved from old Assyria. So what we know, or actually what about 5 people in the world know who study this stuff and whose books I've read, is that 4,000 years ago, we had all the main business elements we have today. There were merchants, there were contracts, there were markets, there were marketplaces, there was monetary exchange, there were money lenders. The idea of return on capital was there. Business law existed. Regulation was there. Jointly owned business structures and partnerships were there, to your point about the company. So, in fact, everything that we do today in business in terms of structures and approaches existed 4,000 years ago. The only two things that didn't exist 4,000 years ago are the company, which is the second part of your question, and what we call limited liability, which I'll come on to later, perhaps. In terms of how did the company as we know it begin, this really began in England in the 16th century. And business around Europe, including England, was by and large done in guilds. Guilds were very curious things, but they were used for everything. They were used for town management, they were used for crafts, they were used for merchants, they were used for knights, and all sorts of stuff. And guilds were kind of a combination of a private members club. So there might be the Guild of Plumbers in Purley, where I live, for example. But they would also regulate the trade. They wanted to make sure that the plumbers didn't get a bad reputation. So you'd have to sort of live up to their rules and all that kind of stuff. But they were also social groups. So the Lord Mayor was on my podcast a couple of weeks ago. In the City of London Corporation, they still have the annual Lord's Mayor procession. So guilds had feast days and festivals and all that kind of jazz. And the problem in the 16th century was that England, which was of utter insignificance at the time, wanted to get out and go further. And to do that, guilds weren't good enough. Guilds were a collection of sole traders. If you and I were in a guild, you'd have your P&L, I'd have my P&L. In terms of getting out, I really mean going to the Spice Islands. Spices were a huge thing in Europe in medieval times. The profits were massive. And so to go far afield, the guild gradually transformed itself into something where, and this literally took a century. I mean, the first company is perhaps the Muscovy Company, about 1555, then ended up going to Moscow. Gradually transformed itself, especially in England, but also in Holland, to something that had permanent capital, at which point we can say it's quite like the company we know today, with important exception that there have been really three types of company, as I indicate in the book. The first is the chartered company, which is terribly important to America. America tends to forget that it had a history, but the history is very relevant. So the first democracy in America came from the Virginia Company, or actually the Virginia companies, chartered companies in England, which set up over there. And in terms of company governance, the company governance was pretty democratic in those days, and that actually transplanted to Virginia. And after seceding from the British Empire, America, well, the 13 colonies and then America as it grew into, used the same pattern of the first version of the company, which is the chartered company. Mm-hmm. That had a very different governance from what we have today. The second type of the company, which by this time was co-evolving in England and America as then the two largest players in the 19th century, was the common law company. Now, of course, there are many differences between the two, and in particular big differences of government, which came back to haunt us. But essentially, the company law company is the legal format we all know today. So in England, you go to Companies House website, and I want to form a new company, and I spend £10, and I've got a new company. The chartered company, you had to lobby the monarch, you had to lobby Parliament to get to one. The third type of the company, which is beyond our small co remit, but definitely applies to fintechs as they grow up these days, is what I call the corporate governance company, which is a completely different type of company, I argue, in the book. Now, that started with the collapse of Penn Central in the US, in New York in the 1970s, and over here with Cadbury in 1992, who changed corporate governance forevermore. In the UK, since 1992, we haven't had an astonishing 25 corporate governance codes, which are a statist dot to dot about what you should do on your listed board. One of the subsections in the book is called Emperor Palpatine was right, in that in whatever it was, Star Wars 1, he said the bureaucrats have taken over. So very briefly, that's 500 years.
Okay. Okay, so moving on. So then I'd be curious about how you define corporate governance. I mean, did you sort of have a definition you work from?
Yes, well, corporate governance, as the phrase is used by everybody, really refers to this post-90s period, Cadbury over here, Sarbanes-Oxley, etc. in the States, whereby the government and its various regulators give privately owned companies a massive bunch of things they have to do, whether they're in law or whether they're in regulation or whether they're in codes. And That is a very, very strange thing. I mean, just from a constitutional perspective, it's by no means clear to me why the government has the right to tell you what you should do on your company board, any more than it has the right to tell you, Peter, how you run your conferences or tell me how I organise my Christmas party. Nevertheless, it has been accepted, and there's a huge sort of corporate governance industry now, which is sort of only slightly second behind the sort of military-industrial complex, I feel sometimes. So I reserve the phrase corporate governance for the statist rules about what listed companies must do. Mm-hmm. More broadly, and this relates much more to the fintech and the small co world, the unlisteds, company governance has been going on forever. In the 16th century, the Muscovy Company, the East India Company, they had to govern themselves. They had to rule themselves from the top, as it were. And corporate governance, frankly, sends me to sleep. And my mates that I know have been doing it for 20 years. You know, whenever I catch up with them for a coffee or a beer, they just moan and moan more and more about how tedious it all is. Whereas company governance is really very exciting. And in terms of, you know, what happens in fintechs, it can be the key factor between failure and success.
Mm-hmm. So then, would you say, does that sort of point to a major difference between a corporate board, say a public company board, and a small like fintech board? What are the major differences between those two?
It's hard to sort of summarize it in sort of one sentence, as it were. The first chapter of the book is 8 essential aspects of small company boards. So there are many ways that it's different. But really, there are two ways. Firstly, that small companies have always been very different from big companies, in the same way that sort of a baby is different from a teenager, is different from a grown-up. The big thing that's changed these days is that on any board, or indeed in the state as a whole, you know, in the Congress and in the Senate and the President or Parliament over here, it's about two things. Firstly, it's about corporate control or state control, making sure the thing doesn't blow up. And that has become almost predominant. On large company listed boards in America or in the UK or elsewhere, it's become about corporate control. It's become about conformance. However, in a small company, you will kill it dead if you major on that. Sure, when you've raised money from other people, you need somebody to check that you're not spending it on sweeties or wasting it or anything like that, or that the accounts add up and all that kind of stuff, of course. However, a small company, a new idea, if you and I, Peter, have an idea after the podcast and we set up a new company tomorrow, firstly, there'll be an idea in their mind. And then secondly, be a tiny spark with kindling. And it's really very, very hard, as we've seen in fintech, the numbers that disappeared over the years, to get that spark to grow. So the point I'm evangelical about is that a small company is a small fire. Anybody who's been a founder, who's been an entrepreneur, or knows one, understands that getting that fire going is a really tough job. There's plenty of factors which will make it blow out. So the small company board, the fintech board, is there, as far as I'm concerned, to help it grow. The subtitle of the book is Making Your Board an Engine of Growth. And as I found by speaking to about some 80, by now over 80 people, founders, chairmen, etc. in London, very few boards, unsurprisingly, really are, should we say, a V8 engine of growth.
Okay. So that's why, I mean, I imagine there are lots of small companies out there that when they get started, they don't have a board at all. So, you know, why should you have a board? Should you have a board right at the get-go? When should you actually start thinking about this?
The problem at the get-go is that you and I have come up with an idea. We have 1,000,001 things to do tomorrow, and it's really not a priority to sort of, you know, create this legal structure called a board. And any founder has to be a jack of all trades on day one, and probably day 2 and day 3 and day 4. And until he's raised some money, it's quite a long time until he's got a CTO, a CMO, a COO, doing all that kind of stuff. So he really is running around doing everything. Practice differs between the UK and US on this one. I haven't researched the US, but everybody tells me that boards per se are far less important in the earlier stages in the US, although there's advisory boards, without getting into the distinction, which can be very important. The simple thing that makes people in London have a board is when they raise significant money. I mean, it's one thing if you raised a bit of money from your friends and family and they trust you. Yeah, go on, Peter. You carry on. Yeah, we trust you. You're not going to go and sort of buy expensive cars and blow our money like that, and you get on with it. However, by the time you're doing crowdfunding from strangers, or certainly by the time you're raising it from VCs or something like that, these kind of people are going to want some representation in your company to to just keep an eye on their investment. So it becomes not just a legal necessity, but a de facto necessity to have one. And this is the stage at which it can start going badly wrong, because if you've got the wrong kind of shareholder on your board, they can be just very interested in making sure you aren't, quote, wasting money or doing the wrong thing, as opposed to helping you grow. And here, the most important fact, almost the most important takeaway for listeners to the show that I found over years of speaking to people about this is that serial founders approach the board. Now, whether that's the main board or the advisory board in the UK or US, let's not worry. They approach it very differently from the first timer. The first timer, of course, doesn't know what he's doing. The first timer, if he's got an experience, it may be on a listed board in some regard and may think it's all about control. But what the serial founder knows is that there are people in the world who can really help you grow your business, who can make a great success of your business, who will never work from you. Yeah, they may have done the same as you and made 1,000 times more money 10 years ago. These people, if you get the right ones, will come into your company 4 times a year, 6, 12, whatever the frequency is, for a short period of time and lend you their skill sets, their expertise, their contacts, their wisdom, their mentoring, all of that kind of stuff to help you succeed. So that's the engine of growth thing. And that's what serial entrepreneurs know. There are some jolly, brilliant people out there at business. They're not going to work for you, but they will turn up in your office for your board.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So then maybe you mentioned these 8 essential aspects. I know you detail them in the book, but and I don't know if we need to go through every single one, but I feel like these are, it's sort of a blueprint for, a new entrepreneur who you said they haven't done this before. So maybe just hit on some of what you think are the most important things they need to consider to really make their board an engine of growth, as you say.
We've discussed essence 1, which is that the top priority in a small co, in a new co, is growth. Mm-hmm. And a good board will help you to grow. We've touched on the fact that the small co board is not a small big co board. It never was back in the day, because you've got a company of 3 people. It's not the same as a company of 100,000. These days, it isn't just the question that a teenager is the grown-up version of a baby, but actually it's the same thing. It's a bit like, as I put it in the board, listing is a traumatic event for many a fintech. And it's probably a rare example in the world where something starts off as a butterfly and ends up having to turn into a caterpillar. And certainly the board culture changes massively at that point. And I do have a section called 2 Tribes Go to War. For any Frankie Goes to Hollywood fans will get the reference. But your pre-IPO board can run in all sorts of challenges around that. The other point is that the governance of small companies is actually far more typical of actually the majority of the companies around the world today and everything in the last 4,000 years. Small companies are generally examples of what I'm calling concentrated control companies. They've got people on the board who really care. Yeah. If I put a whole bunch of money into your company, Peter, and I'm on your board, I really care because it's my money. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is very, very different. And this has proven to be far more successful for thousands of years. People have got real skin in the game. They really care about business compared to what we have these days, which is this statist model of the so-called independent non-executive director, which basically means somebody who actually isn't really allowed to have any connection to your company, isn't allowed to have an investment in your company, doesn't really know very much because he isn't there very often. It is a kind of colonial governorship compared to the democracy of the early chartered companies. So that's actually quite an important point. And also it's a point to remember that actually in no sense are small companies and their governance inferior. Oh, sure, they make mistakes like all human beings make mistakes, like all human organizations make mistakes. But one needs to push back against this status governance. That's particularly important over here because last year, for the first time, there was a code introduced in 2019 called the Weights Code, which now applies to big, small companies. And funnily enough, being bureaucratic, it defines big in 3 different ways, depending on the section. So beware of small company governance. I mean, the last chapter is called Fixing Broken Boards. And one of the problems with boards and trying to fix them, and I think this may happen less in the States than it does in the UK, but I've seen it in the UK, is that somebody that starts off with the mentality, I'm going to get my board right. I'm going to do it like a proper board, by which they mean a grown-up listed company board, because one day I'll be listed. You'll kill it if you do that. The other point is that this is a very important point. Your board is what you make it, for better or for worse. Yeah, it's like your marriage or anything like that. You make it. You create it. If you let it happen to you, you've created it by default. Now, what I see is too many innocent founders, because they haven't been around the loop already because they're so busy doing a million things. Their board is something that happens to them. And funnily enough, once you've got VCs on the board and that, well, VCs are professional, as I put it, professional board goers. They know a hell of a lot about the board game. So it's unsurprising that some, quotes, amateur board goer, like a founder who may, even just go 4 times a year, ends up being jiu-jitsu'd by some guy who probably goes to 3 a week. So your board is what you make it. If it's not creative, it's your fault. You need to be making it creative. Small company boards are CEO-centric, not chairman-centric. By the time you've got listed company boards, the chairman generally sacks the CEO. In early small cos, in early fintechs, by and large, the CEO sacks the chairman. And of course, you get to a stage where there's even power and you get to the stage where the chairman sacks the CEO. The penultimate one is, in terms of the essences of the small co. And this is something which many, many people have misunderstood that have no experience. They say to me, Mike, what's the logical way to go about this? And I point them to this essence. And this is called the cauldrons of emotion: power, betrayal, plotting, and deceit. We're talking about people in a room with different motivations, different desires. We're talking about conflict. We're talking about human emotions. And it's really important to remember that. One chap I met who's been on small co boards and big co boards for 40 years, amazingly enough, he said, and he's a very gentle person, he said to me that the nearest he's come to punching someone in the face was at a company board. I told this story to someone else and he said, I know how he feels. So we must never forget the emotions. You generally don't see that kind of stuff mentioned online. And then finally, the 8th essence is the vital importance of small companies to all economies.
Right. So as as you're a fintech entrepreneur listening to this, and you've got your board in place, and you're fairly new. I mean, I thought it was interesting as you describe how the board should evolve. I mean, obviously everyone knows there's a big step between being a private company and a publicly listed company, and the board needs to sort of reflect that. But there's a lot of steps in between those two. Particularly these days, it's with companies going public later and later. How should a CEO think about the evolution of his board, between sort of the time he first got it going and well before he lists the company?
A VC said a very interesting thing to me, which is that they find that those founders who plan to have a good board from the beginning and who planned to raise capital from the beginning, unsurprisingly, do a much better job of it than those who 3 years in go, oh, we need to raise 10 million. How do we do it? Now, let's take a very simple example. If you've got a new co, you don't bother to have a board. Yeah, you and I form a new co tomorrow. It's the last of our thoughts. We don't even know what we're doing, really. When you're a startup and you've got money from friends and family or just beyond friends and family, a simple tip somebody gave me was just get your accountant along. Or have a professional secretariat. I was told by 1 or 2 people, you get a professional secretariat from your accountancy company, whatever. They come along, you've got sets of board papers going back many years. That really impresses the VCs. In fintech, one of the huge problems is it's massively regulated. I would argue over-regulated, but that's another argument. Mm-hmm. But it also impresses the regulator. When you come for regulation, you say, well, here's my folder with 2 years of board papers in, and they're all done in a professional way. So there are small things like that which do not cost very much money, don't get in the way because, your secretariat or your accountant sits in the corner and doesn't say anything other than sort of, check the bank accounts kind of thing. So that kind of thing can make a difference. We then start to get into the scale-up board. So these are all arbitrary definitions, of course, but what's a scale-up? A startup is still trying to prove that it's got something the world wants. Once you've proven, and once you've got good proof, and obviously it depends whether you're B2B or B2C, how much proof you need, that you've got something the world will buy it, you go, oh, it'd be a really good idea to do more of that. And scale up starts to get a bit of a phase change. I don't tend to get too distracted by A, B, C, D rounds. It just means different things in different companies to me. So in a scale up board, you need to be getting people who can help you grow and who can help you scale. That then leads into the growth company board. The growth company board it's going really very well. You've raised quite a bit of money. And now, the way I put it, you need to turn yourself from being a craft into something that's a bit more like a BMW factory, something which turns out high quality all the time. And again, there's a different skill set there. So one of the main ideas about the board, whether it's advisory board or the main board, it doesn't really matter, a senior forum above the operational level, is to complement at a strategic level your weaknesses. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if your weaknesses are in tech, for example, you obviously need a good CTO, but get somebody on the board who's got experience of that, or in fundraising, or in operationalizing, or one example that was given to me was about outsourcing. This company ended up doing a lot of that. They got somebody on the board, a non-executive director, who had plenty of experience, and it saved them astronomical sums of money in terms of avoiding mistakes as well as enabling them to do well. At some point in your growth company board, you decide that you need to start looking like you could do an IPO one day. Generally, people leave this far too late, and it's a pile of hassle and all that kind of stuff. And then you get into this cultural challenge because you've got these two tribes who are potentially going to go to war.
Right. So I want to talk about some practical kind of examples of board challenges. And we had obviously famously over here several years ago, we had the lending club debacle, and where basically the board came in and demanded the resignation of the CEO. Now, the CEO was the founder, Renaud Laplanche, who put the board together, handpicked all the people on that board, and yet the board turned against him and decided he had to go. Now, I know that this is you've mainly focused on UK things, but I'm interested in sort of what can CEOs do differently where they he's picked the board and then the board goes and turns against them. Have you sort of got any advice for CEOs to prevent that kind of thing happening?
Absolutely, and I tell a couple of tales over here which are slightly similar, which is that when you're forming your IPO-ready board, to have market credibility, you need a market-recognized chairman, which means an experienced listed chairman. These people, by definition of having survived, especially on something like Wall Street, if we're talking about FS, they're not Girl Guides, they're not brownies, they're not sort of church pastors. These are people who have been at the sharp end of some pretty sharp politics for many decades. And these are people who understand the whole board game, a bit like I was saying about VC, far more than a founder. It's a very different skill set, to create something out of nothing. To go from 1 to 0, from 0 to 1, as Peter Thiel puts it, it's just very special art. Very, very few people can do that. But you're moving into a different world. You're leveling up into a completely different level of the game, which is very, very different. The advice I give, which is very simple, which is to realize that when you get your IPO-ready chairman, when you get your listed chairman on board, that he is a very different animal. Your early chairman should help you immensely, should defend you from the capital providers if they're attacking you, to let you get on building a business. But when this chairman comes in, you should regard this chairman as coming in, wheeling a gallows into the corner of the boardroom, and he leaves the gallows in the corner of the boardroom. That is the reality. And an example that you gave, that is what actually happened and came to pass. We've seen examples over here as well. Now, what do you do about that? Well, many people go for a trade sale and avoid the IPO. And then you've got your chance of negotiating a separate deal and all that. I mean, I've met many founders over the years, and they'll say, "Oh, it's fantastic. We've been taken over by so and so. They're such a nice company, and yes, I never really wanted to sell out, but actually, I'll be there, and I like it." Anyway, 2-3 years later, after the earn-out, they all leave and start again. But the recommendation I have to founders in that situation is to have a frank conversation. These things are all like relationships. If you've got a problem in your marriage, the best thing you can do is talk about it. So, when you're hiring your chairman, you ask a more polite version of, "So how many CEOs have you stabbed then? How many have you hung?" Or a bit more politely, you would say, "Obviously, I've been here since the beginning, and it's a very rare CEO that goes all the way from day one to being there 50 years. And how do you see transitions like that? How have you managed it to your new chairman?" Ask them those questions in the interviews. And then you get some idea, and at least you get to understand the real politic, which is, as I said before, in listed companies, the chairman sacks the CEO. That's almost one of his main really important jobs, as opposed to just chairing the meetings and handling shareholders.
Right. Although we have seen, and I mean, obviously with the lending club issue, there was some real issues that happened under the CEO's watch. But there's also we've seen some sort of rogue CEOs. I mean, look, I think about WeWork, for example, where it seems like the board there didn't really rein in the CEO at all. And so, what about when it's sort of the roles are, or not the roles, but sort of the situation is reversed, where the CEO is suddenly making bad choices and the board is, I mean, you see it sometimes, the board's just letting them get away with anything. How can we sort of craft that balance where the board is really holding the CEO to account?
very complex question, and this is basically the thing that corporate governance is struggling with. And the corporate governance answer, i.e. the listed status rules, has been to flood the boards with independent non-executive directors. So you get many supermajority boards in the States where the only executive is the chief executive and there's a whole bunch of independent directors. The evidence that I've seen on that is that there's no evidence that it's actually improving things at all, unsurprisingly. I mean, just on the first point, I mean, I can't comment specifically on Lending Club because actually, Peter, my main source of information on that was your blogs because you're the most accurate and nearer to it. But the thing that strikes me was that BBC had this program called Top Gear, which was the most successful car program in the world. It earned them an absolute fortune, and it now is the Grand Tour for Amazon. And there was some difficulty where the CEO was involved, Jeremy Clarkson, and they got rid of him. And the comment that James May, one of the co-presenters, made about that was this could have been handled in a different fashion. So in the case of the BBC, and I'm not commenting on the Lending Club one, but people always sort of have their own views and opinion who they want on the board with them. In the case of that, the BBC had wanted rid of Jeremy Clarkson, and this just happened to be a convenient reason. And the cultural point, and it does relate to the second part of the question, the cultural point in this two tribes going to war is that the startup tribe, the creative tribe, mistakes always happen. In a startup, things always go wrong. Mm-hmm. Their approach, and I've heard two stories about this from very important people who you would know, their approach is, look, things have always gone wrong. They go wrong less frequently than they have gone wrong. We're going to work it out. No one's going to get fired. We will fix it. We will be stronger for this. The listed Neds, who have got big regulatory risk personally, in terms of being on boards where things go wrong, the FCA over here wouldn't look at them that well, or probably the SEC in the States. The listed reaction to any problem arising is get a lawyer, cover our asses, fire somebody. Very, very different approaches from corporate control to corporate creativity. So that's a clash. Now, to your point about the WeWork, it has been the case in a number of super fast growing techs, which by and large tend to be American. I mean, Uber and is another one, WeWork, is that you've got some sort of charismatic, swashbuckling-y type CEO, who creates something out of nothing astronomically fast, but he's this sort of super creative type, a little bit mad, a little bit crazy, doing some things wrong, but achieving sort of tremendous momentum. However, when you're getting into this grown-up listed world, that's not the thing. It's like, I can't think of an example, but it's like you run around in the playground and you play in the woods and that kind of stuff. And one day you go to school and it's a strict school and you're supposed to wear your uniform and sit down and shut up. They're very different things. And so people can fail to make the transition. And I think in the WeWork's case, obviously it's puffed up by my son and all that kind of jazz. But I think it became quite clear when they dressed that up for an IPO. I mean, there was certainly masses of criticism in the press saying, hang on, this is a bit strange, and hang on, this is a little bit weird. It wasn't really dressed up properly in the first place. And what the board had failed to do, as you say, was to start telling the founder, look, you've got to calm down a bit, yes? If you want to get out now, that's fine. You can have your shares and we'll list and get some boring CEO to take it forward. But you've got to calm down, as it were, metaphorically speaking, get your hair cut, put a suit and tie on, that kind of stuff. That should have been happening in the 2 years run up. They should have tidied up all the sort of funny legal rinky-dinks and all that kind of stuff. You need to start converging from many flowers blooming. There are many ways to create businesses into you've got to go through the eye of a needle when you list.
Mm-hmm, sure. Anyway, we're almost out of time, but so one last question. You've put a lot of research into this book. I know you said it kept on delaying it because you found there was so much more interesting stuff to write about. But so what was the most interesting thing, would you say, that you learned in doing the research for the book?
Two things. The first I've touched on before, but I mean, it really strikes me in my bones, which is that I'd heard more and more about corporate governance. Corporate governance sent me to sleep. There was actually an anecdote in the draft of the book for 2 years, but it didn't make the final sort of cut when I had to sort of cut words out, which told the tale, Peter, of you asking me a few years ago to chair something at a Lendit on corporate governance, because at least I'd sexed it up a bit.
I remember.
And sadly, I had to cut that bit out because it was actually quite a good anecdote. But corporate governance per se is for a certain sort of person, people who are very used to process all their life and just go through bureaucracy. Other people, it would drive them insane. So I've been uninterested because of that. However, I found that there is this thing called company governance. Where did democracy come from in the States? How is the US managed? What's the Federalist Papers say? What do the Anti-Federalist Papers say? How are chartered companies managed in the 16th century in the UK? How did the governance change in the 19th century for better? Actually, mostly for worse, actually. How is it changing now? This is a fascinating world. And in terms of creating something, I've become a complete evangelist to the idea that a good board, and you can create a good board if you knew what to do, and serial entrepreneurs find it out the hard way. But there's a book I can sell you. You can find it much faster. Serial entrepreneurs know that they can create something that really empowers their growth. And I'm absolutely passionate about delivering that message, because it's far too many people just put up with sort of a dull board or one that's not really taking them somewhere. And in those circumstances, the board becomes a ball and chain around the founder's ankle. Then finally, the last thing I found, which is I hated history at school, is my least favorite subject and my least successful subject. But I found actually that if you do look at 500 years of governance, it gives you a hell of a lot of perspective on governance today and why governance today on big companies is going wrong and how to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll have to leave it there, Mike. It's fascinating. You've done I think the world, and particularly the fintech world, is a real service here in sort of going in depth into a topic that really hasn't talked about that much. So appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, see ya. Well, I hope you learned something there. I know I certainly did. And I also learned quite a lot by reading Mike's book. He takes a fairly dry topic and I think makes it very engaging. He's got a really, I think, a very readable style. He uses lots of colourful examples. And I found the book was just a goldmine of information. If you're putting together a board right now, if you're an entrepreneur and you're running a fintech company, you really need to read this book, I think, to make sure that you are getting the most out of your board. Anyway, on that note, I will sign off. I very much appreciate you listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.